A stormy night changed everything for a small, town waitress who had spent her entire life feeling unseen, underestimated, and quietly judged for the color of her skin. As thunder battered the windows of the nearly empty diner, 9 intimidating bikers walked in, men whose presence would have frightened anyone, especially someone used to the world assuming the worst. Yet, what happened in the hours that followed would unravel a chain of events no one in that town could have predicted. By the next morning, her act of compassion would ignite a movement so powerful that more than 1,000 bikers would ride in her name, rewriting the town's story forever. Long before that unforgettable storm rolled in, the diner had been her refuge. A small, aging building tucked a quiet highway that most travelers passed without a second glance. She had worked there for years, moving between tables with practiced grace, balancing steaming plates, while absorbing the unspoken tensions that often settled over the room. Some customers treated her with warmth, but many offered only curt nods, suspicious glances, or the kind of forced politeness that revealed more than they intended. She had learned to navigate those moments with dignity, even when whispers trailed behind her like shadows she could never outrun. The town itself had a long memory but a short tolerance, and she felt both every day. She lived modestly, worked double shifts, and kept to herself, hoping that hard work, alone, might carve out a space where she belonged. Yet a quiet ache lingered, the longing to be seen not as a stereotype or an afterthought, but as a human being with value beyond the assumptions people carried. On most nights, the diner closed early, but the weather forecast called for a violent storm, the kind that knocked out power and left travelers stranded. She stayed late to help her manager, grateful for the extra hours, even as the wind howled against the windows. By the time the lights flickered, she was alone at the counter wiping down surfaces, listening to the rhythmic drip of rain pounding the roof like a warning. Outside, the highway was swallowed by darkness, broken only by the sudden roar of engines approaching in unison. She froze, not from fear of who they were, but from the unpredictable world she had grown accustomed to navigating. In that moment, she sensed the night was about to demand something of her, something she hadn't yet imagined she was capable of giving. The storm intensified until the diner's windows trembled under the weight of the wind, each gust pounding like a fist against the glass. Rain cascaded in sheets, turning the parking lot into a rippling blur of water and shadows. When the 9 bikers stepped through the doorway, soaked and towering, the room seemed to shrink around them. Their leather jackets dripped onto the floor, their boots heavy against the tile, and their expressions unreadable beneath the dim lights. She felt a familiar tension rise in her chest, the instinctual bracing that came from years of navigating unpredictable spaces where her safety depended on staying quiet, polite, and invisible. Yet something was different about this moment. They weren't demanding. They weren't loud. They simply stood there, disoriented by the storm, scanning the room as though unsure if they were even welcome. She felt the weight of their uncertainty as clearly as she felt her own. The power flickered again, leaving the room in a brief shudder of darkness, before the emergency lights buzzed to life. The bikers exchanged glances, their earlier confidence shaking under the force of nature raging outside. Without thinking, she stepped forward and motioned them inside, offering towels, warm coffee, and whatever shelter the diner could still provide. She did it not because she wasn't afraid, but because empathy had always been her default response, an instinct that remained intact despite the world's insistence on hardening her. The men hesitated, surprised by her kindness, before slowly settling into the booths. Even then, she could feel the eyes of the universe holding its breath, as if waiting to see what would unfold next. Outside, the storm grew violent enough to close the highway, leaving the bikers stranded with no option but to wait out the night. She moved from table to table, checking on them as she would any customers, though her heartbeat fluttered beneath her calm exterior. She noticed details others might miss. The exhaustion in their shoulders, the quiet gratitude in their nods, the absence of hostility she had grown so accustomed to receiving from strangers. But as the night wore on, she began to sense something else. The bikers were watching her with a different kind of attention, not predatory or judgmental, but thoughtful. They observed the way she moved, the care she gave, the patience she extended without expecting anything in return. They saw the bruises of a life lived in constant caution, even if numpy were visible on her skin. Near midnight, when the wind reached its peak, and the lights finally went out for good, she lit candles along the counter. The soft glow illuminated the room with a warmth that cut through the storm's fury. The bikers sat quietly, the flickering flames revealing softened expressions, as though the darkness had stripped away the armor they carried. In that silence, she could almost hear the shift happening, not in the storm outside, but in the strangers who had stumbled into her life. They were beginning to understand something. She had never said aloud that kindness, especially from someone the world often mistreated, carried a power capable of transforming even the most hardened hearts. She didn't yet know it, but her small act of compassion would ignite a ripple far beyond that stormy night. Tomorrow, the town would wake to a revelation it never saw coming. When dawn finally broke, it arrived with an eerie quiet, the kind that follows a long night of unrest, leaving the world feeling somehow altered. The storm had passed, but its mark remained where fallen branches littered the highway, power lines sagged dangerously low, and puddles reflected the bruised sky. As the bikers prepared to leave, they stepped outside into the chilly morning air, pausing to look back at the small diner that had sheltered them. She stood in the doorway, exhausted yet steady, unaware that the night had etched her presence onto their hearts in a way she couldn't comprehend. They rode off in a thunder of engines, disappearing around the bend of the highway. She assumed that would be the end of it. Just another night of doing what she always did, quietly offering care in a world that rarely cared back. She wiped down tables with aching arms and tried to settle back into routine, unaware of the storm still brewing. This time not in the sky, but in the hearts of the men she had helped. By late morning, whispers began circulating through town. People mentioned strange traffic on the highway, the kind they had never seen before. The diner's parking lot trembled first with a low rumble, then a growing roar. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the rising sun, and froze at the sight unfolding before her. Line after line of motorcycles, hundreds at first, then what looked like thousands, rounded the curve and filled the road like a procession. Bikers of every age, every background, every chapter from states near and far surged toward the diner, each one riding with purpose. Their engines synchronized in a single, unified pulse that shook the ground beneath her feet. The 9 men from the storm led the front, their gazes fixed on her with a sense of mission. They had shared her kindness with their entire network, telling the story of a woman treated unfairly for far too long, a woman who offered refuge without hesitation, and those who heard it came, not just in solidarity, but in defiance of the prejudice she had endured. As the crowd gathered, more than 1,100 strong, she realized the storm had not ended at sunrise. It had only changed form. This time, it wasn't here to break her. It was here to lift her in a way she never imagined possible. The scene outside the diner transformed into something almost surreal. Motorcycles lined the highway for nearly a mile, their chrome catching the sunlight, as if reflecting the beginning of a new chapter. People stepped off their bikes with purposeful calm, creating a vast semicircle around the building she had quietly served in for years. The air carried a heavy stillness, the kind that blankets a moment right before a truth finally takes shape. One of the original 9 bikers stepped forward, holding a folded piece of paper weathered from the previous night. He didn't need to say anything. The gesture itself carried the weight of everything they had witnessed. The Brotherhood had taken it upon themselves to understand her reality. The subtle exclusions, the suspicious glances, the reduced tips, the assumptions made before she ever spoke a word. They had seen her kindness, and now they had decided the world needed to see it too. Word of the gathering spread through town faster than the storm ever had. Residents peeked from porches, called one another, and soon trickled toward the diner out of sheer curiosity. Some arrived reluctantly, others with unease, but all felt drawn to the extraordinary sight of unity unfolding before them. The bikers had come not for confrontation, but for support, unapologetic, unwavering support for a woman whose worth had been overlooked for too long. They donated to rebuild parts of the diner damaged by the storm, pooled funds to cover her expenses, and pledged ongoing support to the small business that had sheltered them. More importantly, they used their presence to hold a mirror up to the town, a mirror that revealed long ignored prejudices and small cruelties that had quietly shaped her life. The gathering became a symbol of what happens when compassion is returned with amplification rather than silence. Standing at the doorway, she felt something she had rarely allowed herself to feel seen. Not for her labor, not for her resilience, but for her humanity. The magnitude of the moment washed over her, like the gentle afterglow of a storm finally subsiding. Long after the engines faded into the distance, the impact of that day lingered. The town changed, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably, and her story became a reminder whispered far beyond its borders. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the spark that forces a community to finally confront the storm within. Would you have stepped forward that night? Or would fear have kept you from offering shelter to strangers who needed it most?